We're on the final stretch of 2025, and what a year it's been. And as the odds of us ever collectively having just a fairly uneventful year continue to slip ever onwards beyond the horizon, I decided to take a dip into something somewhat safe and predictable to settle the nerves ahead of seeing the year out. And with that, we find ourselves once again on the doorstep of writer, director and naked gym-goer Scott Hillman. For those of you not aware, earlier this year I checked out two other of Hillman's films, 2023's Baby Cat, a film that wasn't so much curated with care and more assembled via shotgun, and 2024's Blue Belt, a technically sound but thematically flawed farce martial arts movie that I was ultimately cool with, but wasn't without its faults. But did you know that Scott made a Christmas movie? Because I didn't until I looked into his filmography. But, sure enough, back in 2021, he released The Magical Christmas Tree. Not to be confused with the 60s film The Magic Christmas Tree, which is a whole other fever dream for another day. And well, it's got Sox Whitmore in it in a lead role again, so I kind of felt like it made sense to make my last two reviews into a trilogy and to round things off properly by seeing where the pair really began, for better or worse. So the film opens with drone footage of a misty winter forest and shots of LA as Sox introduces themselves as Pace, an accountant for a film company with a master's degree and not much else. Pace lives by themselves in a one-bedroom apartment, they have no IRL friends, their parents disapprove of them for who they are and haven't spoken to them in 5 years, and with Christmas fast on the way, the only thing waiting for them on Christmas morning is an Amazon box from the one aunt who does still have the time of day for them, but Pace doesn't let that get them down. They kind of like the structure and routine that a single life offers, and living in LA, Christmas is very rarely the wintry, cosy wonderland that the TV shows portray. So, they intend to work up to Christmas Day, and then just take a day for themselves. Pace heads into work on the 23rd and it's business as usual. Her boss is a ruthless tyrant of a man who quite literally is talking about closing an orphanage because they can't pay their bills on Christmas Eve. He doesn't really care though and laughs at the thought of the misery he's going to cause before going to try and get more money out of the system. Pace's co-worker, a Christmas-centric divorcee who is definitely not over the breakup and is essentially hyper-focused on Christmas as a coping technique, asks Pace what they're going to be doing for the holidays. To which they reiterate pretty much what the opening narration established. However, the next day, something strange occurs. Because at the start of the day on Christmas Eve, Pace's boss bursts into the office wearing a nightcap and gown and joyfully proclaims to the entire staff that last night he was visited by 3 spirits who've completely showed him the error of his ways. And now, he wishes to make up for lost time with the most Christmassiest Christmas to ever mass around the Christ. What does that mean in real terms? Well, it means that the day's work is now off the table because the boss wants to throw a luxurious Christmas dinner and dress the office for major Christmas party shenanigans that evening. And so, he begins to delegate responsibilities to his staff members to help prepare for the occasion, with Pace getting probably the most important job of all, locating, cutting down and bringing back to the office a Christmas tree. But not just any Christmas tree. This can't be from a lot or a store. It has to be one from out in the wild, and it absolutely has to have a magic feeling to it. Now, Pace is no lumberjack, so they're a little confused as to where to even begin to find a tree like that, especially on Christmas Eve. But a co-worker mentions that deciduous firs can be found in the local national reservation. So, Pace tools up with a dozen bags of chips and an axe and heads out to secure the spirit of Christmas. Unfortunately, almost immediately that plan goes to the wall when a park ranger pulls Pace up to ask what they're doing, at which point he unfortunately tells them that unless they want to trek almost 100 miles from where they've parked, they're only going to encounter oak trees. And even if they do get 100 miles into the reservation and they find a fir, they'd still have to figure out how to get it back, and it's also kind of illegal to chop down trees on federal land. However, he does inform them that it is technically not illegal to chop down trees in national forests, and that there's a national forest not too far away from here that does have an abundance of fir trees. Pace thanks the ranger and heads off into the woods to secure it. While that's going on, we then cut back to the office for what will be one of about 3 to 5 B plots as the boss formally pairs up the employees to take on the rest of the tasks. And because he's supposed to be a bit thick, he pairs up the totally wrong people to handle the totally wrong things. For example, putting the Christmas-centric divorcee together with a Muslim woman who doesn't even celebrate Christmas to cook a massive goose in the office with nothing available to actually cook with other than whatever they can find to season it in the office kitchen and a small microwave. A couple of out-of-touch colleagues are put in charge of arranging the entertainment and spend most of the film gossiping about how well or badly the other co-workers are getting on with their jobs. And one employee somehow manages to opt out of the whole thing entirely and spends almost the entire film job hunting and chatting to folks on the phone about random topics. Oh, and the vice president of the company slowly starts to lose his mind over the fact that his boss has clearly had some kind of mental break and at first tries to minimise the impact his generous new nature is having on the company's profits before a subplot begins where he basically tries to get him ejected from the board. All of the above plot lines will be dipped in and out of across the whole runtime with an increasing mixture of dry, withering and sarcastic self-aware comedy, and none of them will really even get much in the way of a resolution. Back at the forest, Pace arrives and begins trying to find the perfect magical fur, but it becomes clear that they're being observed, and it's not long before the mysterious stalker reveals themselves, as we're introduced to Buddy, a person dressed in an emerald cloak with elf ears claiming to be a non-binary woodland elf, and in particular the guardian of these forests and protector of the trees. Pace can't quite believe what they're saying and dismisses them as just being some kind of crazy person, which Buddy takes very seriously and gets quite upset about. Pace tries to tell Buddy that chopping trees down in national forests is legal, but Buddy shrugs it off, saying they care not for man's law. Buddy tells Pace to leave, but Pace says that they have to do this to prove to themselves and their boss that it can be done. And what follows from there is an extended set of scenes of Pace and Buddy wandering aimlessly in the forest trying to find fir trees, while Buddy mocks Pace for doing what they're doing, while Pace begins to open up to Buddy, and slowly Buddy begins to open up to them. Eventually, the pair begin to bond over their related experiences, and a little bit of romance starts to blossom. But when the ranger who told Pace about the furs reappears to warn her to be on the lookout for a homeless person they've been tracking for the past 5 months, running around the forest pretending to be a wood elf, Pace has to decide whether to take a chance on a well-intentioned stranger, or whether turning Buddy in is the right thing to do. In a 60-minute march to an inevitable conclusion, will Pace and Buddy bring Christmas to LA? Will the ladies actually manage to cook the goose in the microwave without giving everybody botulism? And
fucking noddy!
All this and more will be answered if you check out The Magical Christmas Tree. And I suppose the quick caption review for this one is, it's fine. I liked it way more than Baby Cat, but not as much as Blue Belt. It's probably the most technically proficient Scott Hillman movie, but probably one of the least interesting scripts he's written to date. The script for me is probably the weakest element of this whole production, honestly, and it's mainly to do with the structuring and pacing of it all. The plot, I don't really have an issue with. Lonely accountant is sent on an unexpected quest, meets a fellow lonely soul, and the two bond over their uniquely relatable situations, leading to a blossoming romance and some healing, is a fine enough plotline for this kind of movie. But it really does depend on how that plot's handled as to how successful it is. And here, I just don't feel like they pace it out well enough. The romance elements are too subtle at first and come on too strong in the closing 15 minutes of the film. We swap from frenemies to lovers much too quickly, and I don't feel like the characters of Pace and Buddy are that significantly different enough to make it feel like they stand on their own 2 feet. It feels more like they just took Pace's character and copy-pasted them and did some slight tweaks to the dialogue. I appreciate that Scott seems very keen to increase the number of LGBTQIA+ films that are out there. It's a noble endeavour, and I appreciate the first step to getting good at something is to not be so good at it for a time, but I've seen 3 examples of his attempts at LGBT cinema now, and none of them feel particularly believable or engaging in my opinion. They all feel a bit shallow or weird or inauthentic to real-life relationships. The dialogue choices here, and in Scott's other movies, all have a whiff of dubbed anime to them, and it makes it hard to really take these films seriously when it's clear Scott would seemingly just really want to make an LGBTQ slice-of-life, quirky comedy anime series. Like Baby Cat or Bluebell, this film would have probably made a half-decent OVA anime, but in live action, it just feels a bit unusual. Like how live-action porn parodies of cartoon series sometimes just feel a bit unsettling. It feels like he has the ideas, but not the right tools for the job. Like a sculptor trying to realise his visions using blow pens. Adding to this that the pacing of the A-plot is rammed with padding, which also doesn't help. The first act is fine enough in setting up pace and buddy, but by the time that's done and dusted, which makes up about 20 minutes of the film, it just seizes up into a runaround of quirky and pathos-ridden conversations, pratfalls, and highly animated facial reactions to things, right up until about the final 10 to 15 minutes or so, when it remembers it's actually got to do something with the characters and turbocharges the romance element to get them to the end goal in time. It makes the second act of this thing basically almost entirely skippable, because nothing that really happens in the second act has any kind of impact on the first or third. This is only further complicated by the many B-plots, which feel more like vignettes rather than a coherent narrative. They essentially just repurpose a straight man Fall Guy act into 2 or 3 different silos that don't really interact with each other, and each time we cut back it's basically just to progress a joke that should have been about 5 to 10 minutes long in any other movie, but for some reason is 15 to 25 minutes long here. It feels like there are just too many characters involved in these B-plots, with not enough character development to justify everyone being in this. Honestly, I think they'd have just been fine with the ladies cooking the goose subplot, and the VP maybe dipping in and out to remove the president. That would have been more than fine enough. The guy job hunting didn't really do anything to help improve the plot here, and the 2 guys in charge of arranging the entertainment just feel awkward to me in this. Because you don't really see them do much of anything other than commenting on what's going on. I feel like they could have been cut entirely without much at all being lost. Comedy is fairly subjective as a field, and I would consider a comedy successful if it made me actually laugh, or at least left me with a couple of moments that I could recite as being good examples of how funny the film could be. This film managed to get me to grin a couple of times, and 24 hours on from watching it, I couldn't tell you a single gag in the thing, which does not bode well. The pathos elements in there, such as the divorced lady finally reaching a breakthrough or Pace and Buddy sharing emotional moments, don't really feel earned either, because we don't really see them put the work into reaching that point of character development. They're not fine, and then they suddenly are, which makes it really hard to relate to them, honestly. Not helped either by the fact that all of the characters in this have their personalities literally bullet pointed in the introduction, and I thought that that was going to be a clever moment, where they overtly tell you what these characters are in the hopes that later they can subvert those expectations when things start to get a little crazier. But they didn't. They literally all just stayed exactly the same for pretty much the entire runtime, which not only made this plot plodding, padding-ridden and kind of flat, but overtly boring too. The act structures aren't particularly strong either, with the first act being about as good as it gets before we essentially wind up in a mushy, melting second and third act hybrid. There aren't really clear transition markers. The third act is about 5 minutes shorter than the second act, which wouldn't be a problem if the film wasn't an hour long from top to tail and has about 5 minutes of titles and credits, meaning we really feel the bloat begin to set in by the time the second act kicks in. To be honest, I feel like it's the cast that kind of saved this thing ultimately, as their interpretations of the characters and the tone of the delivery of the lines given to them manages to take a script that realistically could have been awful in the wrong hands and transform it into something kind of passable when married up to the other elements of this production. I'm not saying this script is inherently awful, I liked it a fair bit. I just don't like that it doesn't feel particularly considered or genuine given the subject nature. In my opinion at least. The script was written and directed by Scott Hillman, and we've covered him before on the show. A full bio breakdown was available on my Baby Cat review, but since writing and releasing that, his latest film, Bump in the Night, has seemingly completed production and should be released soon, if not already. He also seems to be continuing to grow as a cam-op and in the electrics department, with 2 new credits as of 2025. And it's here once again that I hit the Scott Hillman paradox of quality. Scott in the past has been pretty open about the fact that his films generally are shot in very condensed sessions, usually over 2 to 4 days, and it's basically anyone who turns up can help. What does that mean in real terms? Well, it means that some scenes will have been fully crewed, some scenes will have maybe 2 or 3 people crewing, largely handling sound and lighting, and some scenes are Scott flying entirely solo, guiding the cast from behind the camera. And as such, and as I've said in my previous reviews of Scott's films, it makes it kind of hard to really judge his abilities as a director because, say this was a 3-day shoot and he only had a crew for one of those 3 days, how am I supposed to be able to make a reasonable deliberation on his directing abilities if 66% of the film was just Scott and a tin of SpaghettiOs on the crewing call sheet? It's a moral dilemma. So I guess in the absence of knowing he had a consistent crew throughout, I can only judge the film by its professionalism. And it's not bad. Not bad at all. It's safe. Don't get me wrong, it's a very safe film. It's not trying any over-the-top effects, it's not really trying to experiment, some shallow depth of field shots are about as interesting directionally as this film gets. But it's a very consistent production that holds together fairly well, and there aren't any pitfalls in lighting, camera direction or set building. Given it's a low, no-budget production, I'd go as far as to say this is actually some quite impressive work in terms of maintaining continuity across the entire production, with only a few iffy moments I'll mention when I get to the Cine. But yeah, this feels like a lower-end Hallmark Christmas movie, which, given the budget, is actually a very sincere compliment here. Direction of the cast is a little stiff if I'm being totally honest. A lot of the cast stay firmly planted to the spot for most of their scenes. I get the feeling that's because Scott was playing around with depth of field and likely didn't have a lot of time for retakes if it got screwed up. So he kept the cast firmly in place to try and keep a firm hand on the rudder from a continuity and timekeeping standpoint. Which is a little underwhelming, honestly. Contrasting that, the scenes with Pace and Buddy get a lot more physical movement around the scene and even some solid prop use. But it feels a bit awkward and clunky. Again, it feels like Scott wanted the characters to move in a kind of animation style and real humans don't quite bend and flex that way. So instead, both Socks and Kai seem to just flail around to the best of their ability. I can see what's being attempted, and it's a very valiant attempt, but I just don't think it works here for me. Cast delivery on the whole is a bit of a gauntlet of peaks and troughs, so for now all I'll say is that I don't think they quite nailed the dialogue deliveries here as well as they did in Blue Belt or Baby Cat, but that's not through lack of trying. On the Cine front, again, not a whole lot to say. It's a sturdy and solid professional attempt that, for the most part, nails the brief. Shots are mostly well composed, have a good consistency when sequence building, they got at least some coverage, though I'll always want more B-roll truthfully, and the colour use of dark greens, browns and blues add a really nice moody touch to proceedings. Unfortunately, the issues fall outside of Scott's ability to grab a shot. Firstly, this film is way too over-reliant on stock footage, to a frankly upsetting degree. Almost every sequence has at least 1 to 3 stock footage shots in it, either of drone shots of cities, drone shots of forests, establishing shots for venues, or nature stock footage, and it's an obvious insert most of the time, to the point that it becomes irritating to me. Stock footage really is supposed to be used sparingly unless it's being purposefully overused for the intent of the narrative, as in parody or as a plot mechanism. This just uses it as part of the padding, and in part to make the film feel grander than it is, but it's overused and it totally pulled me out of the action. Secondly, the lighting, which is largely flat or natural lighting. I get with the film mostly being on location that they couldn't really drag a lighting rig up there, but the indoor location scenes are all shot very minimalist and flat. There's no real experimentation or stylization. All of that's been created in post with colour grading that kind of mutes out all of the vibrant colours for the scenes, which I thought was quite disappointing. That colour correction in post also causes some issues later in the film when they have to do day for night that looks so obviously done it just really distracted me. On the whole, the grade works with the tones of the movie, but I really just wished they'd done something interesting with the lighting beyond just working with what they had or playing it overly safe. And the final issue is a one-off, but I do have to bring it up. For some unknown reason, Scott decided there needed to be a green screen clipped bear in the film for a couple of scenes, I don't know why it's there, but there are two versions. One is clearly cropped out of some nature stock footage, and the other one is positively Neil Breen inspired. It serves no purpose, it doesn't really add anything to the film, and just totally threw me for a loop when I saw it. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry, honestly. Outside of those points, the sequences are fairly well assembled, but again, a bit safe. It's rhythmic cutting back and forth between the office sequences and the location work. It would have maybe been nice to do some parallel play, or to have maybe tried to integrate the two plots a little bit better, rather than just treating them as two separate stories and having one 2-minute scene right at the very end that overlaps the two plots before abruptly ending things. I just came away from this visually thinking that Scott clearly can bring what he has in his head to the screen, but the lack of budget and time, or his insistence on only doing 1 or 2 takes and cramming as much into a day as he can, hinders his work much more than helping it. Performance-wise, well, Sox Whitmore and Kai Mullen as Pace and Buddy are passably good. I don't think this is Sock's worst performance, but it's clear they're a character actor and they have a specific type of performance they do well in. Here, it's a little stilted at times, not as strong as their work in Blue Belt, but definitely better than Baby Cat, with a slightly awkward but very optimistic performance matched by nervous physical energy that brings their personality shining to the surface. As far as I can see, this is Kai's first feature, and they do a really solid job here as well. Again, you get the feeling that there's a bit of the jitters going on at times here, but Kai chose to play the character with a degree of subtlety that contrasts the somewhat more eccentric character typing quite well. I enjoyed their performance. Though, as an aside, naming the only elf character in this film after the most famous elf of the 21st century is a bit too on the nose for my taste, personally. As for the supporting cast, they're fine enough. They're essentially all paired into fall guy, straight guy roles. I wasn't the hugest fan of some of the more outlandish performances, but they just about keep it together. There wasn't any performances I thought were overtly bad or anything like that. I just kinda wished they'd had a bit more space to physically act through the scene and a bit more depth as characters to help give them something to work with as a contrast. It felt like a bit of a missed opportunity there. And finally, the soundtrack. Stock music once again, but this time with a distinct Christmas twist. From a wide array of audio library and royalty-free sites, most of which I know because I've used them in these reviews on occasion. If you didn't know they were stock, you'd probably think they were a bit generic, but fine. As I'm very intimately versed with them, I spent most of the film chasing the tracks back to their origins and having a good laugh. I don't like films that have predominantly royalty-free soundtracks. I understand why they did it here, but it did kind of bring things down a bit for me ultimately. The Magical Christmas Tree was released in 2021 and hasn't had a physical media release yet that I can see. Instead, it's been released on Tubi and Amazon Prime, and more recently Cinema Epoch put the whole thing up for free on their YouTube channel. It's compressed a bit, I noticed some artifacting here and there, but it's a perfectly watchable film and looks decent on larger screens. And as a sweetener for checking it out, Scott and the cast recorded a feature-length audio commentary for the film, which is also available on YouTube in full for free. Can't say fairer than that. The Magical Christmas Tree, for me, was a bit underwhelming. I was going into this hoping for something a little bit more festive feeling, and while it does have all the hallmarks of a Hallmark Christmas classic, it didn't quite manage to make me feel all that festive. Instead, we had a slightly rushed LGBTQ+ love story that had the energy but lacked the slow boil needed to make it work, Cine that was just about up to snuff but lacked polish, and performances that do the job, and only the job. Is this one you should rush out to check out? I'd say no. But if you're bored and flicking through Tubi, you could do worse. If it sweetens the deal, I've made a great drinking game out of this film by taking a drink or shot every time the characters say Christmas, elf or tree. You will die. Don't say I didn't warn you.